The Humachine, Humankind, Machines, and the Future of Enterprise. The title of the book I will discuss today with its co-author John Wood says it all. Humans and machines are on the verge of creating a world in which the merge between the two may give life to new forms of intelligence, to different economic systems, new societies, and perhaps new ways of being human. By reading this very detailed and profound book, I have learned that the future of humanity is still in the hands of humans, and that machines are extremely efficient at executing tasks we struggle with, but incredibly limited in doing things human beings do naturally. This is called the Moravec's paradox, and we'll talk about it during the interview. I have also learned that the challenges ahead of us are many, and that for a more just and prosperous world to emerge, we need technological progress to go hand in hand with philosophical, legal, political, social, and economic progress. Lastly, I have learned that companies and organizations can already harness the power of the interaction between men and machines, and that by doing so, they can grow into something as complex and powerful as a Humachine. I am very pleased to welcome co-author of the Humachine, Humankind, Machines, and the Future of Enterprise, John Wood. John, welcome to Lux and Tech.
Hi, Carlo. Nice to be here.
I have really enjoyed reading your book because it has helped me build a mental map of all the things we need to take into account while introducing more algorithms, automations, and robots in our life. For example, is it true that data storage is perhaps one of the biggest technological challenges of the near future?
It's certainly one of them. We're producing more data now than we ever have in human history, and it's actually quite a stunning amount of energy is required to maintain that data. And there's recent studies coming about how artificial intelligence is surprisingly data hungry. And so it does itself pose an energy and environmental sustainability challenge.
On this regard, you wrote in the book that although big data is crucial to the development of artificial intelligence, collecting data for the sake of collection is not necessarily the smartest thing to do.
That's right. There's a big difference between information and intelligence. And what we need is actionable insights. And so while we're generating a ton of data, not all of it's relevant. And in fact, there's quite a lot of noise. And not everything that can be counted counts. And that's something that Einstein said. And I think it's true now, where we're trying to gather data and there's surveillance everywhere. And analyzing that data, and unless you have actionable insights, more data is not necessarily better.
And that's where you write that maximum intelligence is not necessarily what we need to pursue, but rather useful intelligence.
That's right. So I'm sort of a pragmatist, but to illustrate that point, we can all think of someone in our personal network that is probably the most intelligent person we know. They're just brilliant. They have insights. They could speak to anything, or they can perform computations in their head, but they're not necessarily the most successful person that you know. And when you imagine that person, they might be socially gregarious or very lucky, but there's something about them. It's not necessarily intelligence. So those are two separate things. And what we need is not necessarily artificial general intelligence, the sort of unicorn or pot at the end of the rainbow. What we need is useful artificial intelligence, and it can be very narrow and still quite powerful if we use it in the right way.
Absolutely. Before I ask you to explain the word Humachine, which I understand you have created, I'd like to talk about the superintelligence you refer to in the book, which would be at the base of a Humachine. And what is superintelligence, and how can this be achieved?
Superintelligence is defined by Professor Nick Bostrom and his book by that title. And it is essentially a qualitatively superior form of intelligence. It is faster, it is more accurate, it is capable of parsing data that goes beyond human comprehension in its size and its speed, and essentially outstripping human intellect across all domains of relevant interest. And Bostrom points out various pathways to superintelligence, and what we do in the Humachine is essentially go through an analysis of all the different major pathways in terms of how useful are they to business leaders today. Because even though a pathway might be theoretically possible, if it's not practically attainable on a relevant time horizon, it's not actionable. And so it might as well be sci-fi. And there are several different pathways, including sort of famously neural lace, which is the latest in computer brain interface. And we believe that is exceedingly dangerous, actually. And I would like to see a moratorium on CBI research until we can put some boundaries around it. But that's just one of the pathways. And another one of them is whole brain emulation. And again, very interesting. You're essentially taking the brain of a genius, turning it into glass, scanning it into a computer, and replicating it. And it's theoretically possible, but practically unattainable in the next 20 years for reasons that we go into in the book. But the pathway that we suggest is organizational network intelligence, which is to say, to create a Humachine, which harnesses the highest powers of humankind and that of machines, and combines them using a process that gets the best out of both. And that is capable of producing superintelligence, in our view, and it is readily attainable today. So it is the only real viable option for enterprise.
And you refer to it as a collective form of intelligence, don't you?
That's right, meaning it goes beyond one individual intellect. It's harnessing the insights and the capabilities of all the humans on your team, all the human knowledge that's available through books or through online literature, as well as the processing powers of machines. And you aggregate that through a network, whether it's a CRM platform or some sort of medium of exchange, and the entire entity itself can follow decision protocol so that the entity itself, the collective, ends up making decisions that are super intelligent decisions.
These are super intelligent decisions. Does that mean we are implying that a company is an individual per se?
Yes, and forgive us for speaking a little figuratively there, but there's some philosophical grounds beneath that figurative language, and that we're actually taking the position that an organization could have collective intentionality, that it could have, in a word, a mind of its own. And that's controversial, and plenty of philosophers would disagree with me, but I think that it's actually borne out, and I give plenty of examples in the book itself, that when we say Microsoft invents an operating system, that's not reducible to any individual within Microsoft. And that legally speaking, and maybe it's just a legal fiction, but it has a powerful effect on the real world. We say a company does X, or a company decided to do X. That's literally true. It's not just a figure of speech. And using organizational network intelligence, we think that the big breakthroughs of the future are going to come from enterprise. They're going to come from a product of super intelligent organizations.
Is there any company yet to have achieved the status of super intelligence, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's aspirational. So we don't think any particular companies are super intelligent in the sense that Bostrom defines it, or we're not ready to give anyone credit for creating a Humachine just yet. But what we say is that the tech companies leading the way, and we all know who we're talking about, FANG stocks, they are exhibiting Humachine traits. Now, I wouldn't call them a Humachine per se, unless I also thought that everything they were doing was just and wise, because we like to think a Humachine would also be wise, not just cunning, not just smart, but also prudent. And so that's why we're not giving anyone credit for actually creating a Humachine yet.
To help our audience better understand and visualize how a Humachine would look like, isn't it worth mentioning Kasparov's law?
I think so. And this was a great influence on our book, actually. And I grew up sort of idolizing Garry Kasparov as a chess genius and as an archetype of what human intellect could attain, and as an inspiration. And his book about the limits of artificial intelligence and human creativity, he goes into his ultimate chess tournament, and that thought experiment, sorry, that tournament, that example actually was very inspiring for the direction that we took this book. And Kasparov's law holds that an ordinary human combined with an ordinary machine following the right process can create extraordinary results, and in fact could outperform a genius human or a supercomputer acting in isolation. And so, following Kasparov's law, we can take existing human resources as we are today, existing compute power, and come up with extraordinary outcomes. In fact, we would say you could actually create a Humachine with super intelligence using those resources. It all depends on how you combine them.
Wow, that's really powerful and inspiring. I'm not sure, though, whether everyone is familiar with the infamous Kasparov's defeat. Would you like to tell the story?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure Gary loves this story being told, but he did, in fact, lose to Deep Blue. And it was a monumental milestone in the history of computation and in artificial intelligence research. And at the time, this wasn't just the first time that Gary had lost to a computer. He had beat Deep Blue before. This was the first time he had ever lost to anyone in a professional setting. So it meant a lot to him that it happened to Deep Blue. And one of the things that he ascribes the loss to in part was he resigned from a match in a sort of an emotional reaction to a move that Deep Blue made that upset him. And he says, if I hadn't resigned, I might not have ultimately lost the tournament. But the power of emotions is not just a vice. We think it's also a virtue, again, if it's used in the right way. And that's one of the things that humans bring to the equation, our emotional intelligence, that we may never program into a bot. I'm deeply skeptical of research findings that an AI can recognize emotion or mental states based on pictures alone. I think we should all be deeply skeptical of that.
Yeah, that would take discrimination to a whole new level. Now, let's assume for a moment that somebody creates a Humachine, so some sort of a collective superintelligence. How do we ensure that this intelligence is the expression of the company as a whole, of all its people, rather than the expression of its top management's view only?
That comes down to governance and process, and ultimately who's controlling the inputs and the outputs. And organizations can do what's called self-regulation, where they basically have a code of ethics, and the programmers that are writing code ascribe to the code of ethics, and the management and the directors and officers and executives all understand. They have transparency into what the algorithms are doing with the data, and they have accountability for the outputs of the algorithms, because you can't put an algorithm on trial. You can't hold an algorithm accountable. You have to have human responsibility ultimately.
So how do you see companies harmonizing internal regulations with quarterly results?
Well, that goes to a deeper issue, which is the ultimate incentive structure for for-profit enterprises. And that actually brings me back to a book that my co-author and I had written before, Foundations of Sustainable Business, where we actually do harmonize those things. We do reconcile the requirement, essentially, that businesses are profitable with the overarching moral obligations to the planet, to future generations, to stakeholders that aren't shareholders of the company. And we think that ultimately you can create a sustainable competitive advantage and profitability by positioning your company as answering social, economic, and environmental challenges instead of creating them or exacerbating them.
Going back to Kasparov's law, and in order to understand it better, I think it's worth mentioning Moravec's paradox as well. Because here we are saying humans plus machines plus a superior process produce an output which is far superior than any other alternatives. But why?
Right. And the elegance of Kasparov's law is that it leverages Moravec's paradox, which essentially holds that where computers struggle, biological intelligence is naturally gifted. Humans are naturally gifted, and vice versa. Where humans have a hard time doing something, computers excel easily. So performing large computations, a machine can do that really quickly, whereas it's kind of an effort, even for very smart humans. They have to burn calories doing that, and it takes time, and there can be errors. Whereas something that a person could do, like readily intuiting the dynamics of a room, so reading the room, for example, and understanding who's against what and who's on whose team, it might be impossible for a machine to do that anytime soon. And so Moravec's paradox can stymie our efforts to make computers behave like people. And what I'm saying in the book is that we don't need to try and resolve Moravec's paradox. That's just a stubborn fact about the world. We may never be able to program AI to think like a person. And I also think it's futile for us to be trying to get humans to be as mathematically proficient as a machine. That's not something we should try and sort of resolve the paradox. We just need to embrace it. We need to leverage it. And that's why if we can find ways to combine humans and machines in the right way, it's a source of power instead of a limitation.
In fact, in the book you say that the image of the future is not that of you replaced by a machine, but rather that of you with a machine.
That's right. And that's to speak to the overall concern, the economic anxiety about what we call bot sourcing, which is like outsourcing, but it's to a machine or a robotic process. There will be bot sourcing. In fact, there should be more. I mean, when we look at the United States and the meatpacking industry, it's unclear to me why there are humans doing those jobs still anyways. It's an incredibly unsanitary environment. The workers are getting infected with COVID-19 because of that. It should be automated, right? And repetitive, stressful, dangerous work should be done by robots. And I think we can find other sources of work for the people that are displaced by that. Now, there will be white-collar jobs that get bot sourced, in mid-level managerial jobs that are repetitive, processing paperwork. That's something that if that's all you do and that's your job, there's a high likelihood that will be bot sourced in the next 5 years. And so we call this Silicon Wave. It's coming for all sectors of the economy, not just long-haul trucking, not just potentially, in a factory setting like assembling cars, but doing things that we traditionally associate with human work. The bank tellers have been replaced by ATMs, and the same process has been in effect for the last several decades, but it's really accelerating because of more sophisticated machine learning. And it's also being accelerated by the pandemic, which is forcing people to work from home. It's forcing companies to find ways to carry on business without human workers. And so they're reaching for automation as a solution.
John, to ensure that people understand how the job market is going to look like, what are the skills that, based on your research, they have to develop in order to survive and hopefully strive in this transitionary period?
Sure. I think that I heard that China is actually having all of their primary students learn computer programming in the same way that we have everyone learn how to read. And that's not a bad idea, because interfacing with machines and knowing how to execute a command function, that's going to become necessary to carry on. Maybe not in our adult lifetimes, but soon thereafter. That this change is happening gradually and then all of a sudden very fast. So learning STEM sufficiently, the science, technology, engineering, and maths, just to be competent, that's a baseline. But I also think this is critical. We can't neglect human skills, uniquely human skills. In fact, there will be a premium for people that have those skills, and by which I mean leadership, emotional intelligence, the ability to care effectively to care about the right things at the right time in the right manner, that's something that's extremely hard, if not impossible, to teach a machine. And so people that have those skills are going to be relevant long into the future, I think.
I come from an industry, the luxury industry, which has always relied very heavily on the human touch. Is that going to last, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. And that's one of the things, on the laundry list of uniquely human skills, including aesthetic judgment and product design and customer service. There are ways that we can use AI to facilitate that. But at the end of the day, we need the human touch. And that's what people are willing to pay extra for, that they don't just get the standard issue automated response, that they have an actual human being that's hearing their tone, that's understanding where the customer's coming from, and is providing a high quality product or service. And I think quality is critical, because with 3D printing and automated systems, minimum viable products are going to be very easy to put out. Yes. Anyone could do it. And so how are you going to differentiate your product or your service without quality? And I mean superiority in product design, sustainable design, more durable goods. So I think that companies that use planned obsolescence to move product, I think they're going to fail. And I want them to fail. It infuriates me, a product that falls apart easily. The phrase, they don't build them like they used to. I'm tired of that phrase.
Yes.
I want us to be building homes and cars and cell phones and computers in ways that are durable, and we have the materials for it. We could do it. And I think the companies that take that leap of faith and just start doing that, they could charge a much higher price. I think they will get customers. And so consumer expectations are changing with the amount of data that is available about us. And I don't like that much data is available, but that's the state of the world. I think our expectations is that the companies know who they're dealing with, and that they should be offering us products that actually serve our needs and our wants.
I agree. Now, there's another topic covered in the book that I'm very interested in. You mentioned that by relying too heavily on automations, we may lose certain types of expertise or even cognitive functions. And as an example, you write about infusion pumps in hospitals. Would you like to elaborate more on this?
That's right. We're concerned about the atrophy of cognitive skills or just formulas or methods for getting work done. If you automate a process, that's all well and good. It could make you more efficient. It could reduce error rates. But say you've got a power outage and you're in a hospital setting, and all of the nurses have automated the dose administration of drugs, and they forgot the formula because they haven't had to do it in so long. They don't know how to titrate the dosage anymore. That's a real vulnerability that comes from over-reliance on technology. So as we bot source certain functions, we need to retain those human skills. Even if it's just as a backup layer, we still need to be able to get work done.
There is another theme I'd like to discuss with you because I think it's very important and your message is extremely powerful. Human biases. John, how can people learn to leverage technology to overcome their biases? And in doing so, should they learn to think like machines or to think with machines?
Sure. Well, bias is a loaded word because there is a legal framework in the United States for racial bias, gender bias, and the essentially discrimination. And so I just want to put a bracket around that and set that to the side. That's a legal wrong. It's a moral failing, but that's different than what we're talking about here. In the book, we're talking about cognitive biases, and this is limits on human rationality, limits on human self-interest, and things that are sort of baked into how our cognitive apparatus works that make it very hard for us to be perfectly rational. And so our ego gets in the way of things. We fall victim to self-serving bias or confirmation bias, where we're only the only data that's showing up to us is the data that suits our interests or that confirms what we already believe. And that's just a bug of human nature. Even cognitive experts that know all about these biases and that publish on them and study them are also subject to them. So it's sort of inescapable. That's just the nature of the lens through which we see the world. It shows up in a biased way. And so we can use technology to de-bias ourselves, where we know that this is a risk that we're going to be subject to this kind of a bias. We can build in to the decision-making protocol remedies for that. We could have sort of stop and check and quality controls and automated reminders and various things to set up our decision-making process so that we are de-biasing ourselves.
Can you give me a practical example? What shall somebody like you and I do to overcome our confirmation bias, for example?
Well, I think it's important to check your assumptions. That's a practical example is when you go into a negotiation and you think that your price is right because you're looking out in the market and you're essentially looking for comps as to your price, but you're looking for, if you're the seller, high price comps because that confirms your prior belief that that's what your product is worth. So just going out of your way to look at things from your contractual counterparty's point of view, or to make sure that you're looking at a broad enough data set, or that you're not selecting data in a self-serving manner, that would help remedy that bias.
All right. So is data you look at?
Well, as opposed to intuition or belief, yes, we want to make data-driven decisions, and I think that's going to become increasingly imperative as data becomes available. The market will tolerate less failure based on using bad data or no data at all, because the market expects that and your competitors are doing that now.
And speaking of biases, artificial intelligence is not necessarily free of those. Now I'm thinking of the disastrous case of Microsoft TIE on Twitter a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's right. The shortcoming, sort of the Achilles heel of AI, is that it is so dependent on the data that is fed into it. And so the phrase garbage in, garbage out applies. And so if you have a biased data set, that bias is going to be baked in, and anything that comes out of the algorithm is going to be tainted by it. And that's one way to deal with bias. And say you're doing banking applications and you are approving loans based on who you've historically given loans to, whatever bias was in that historical data set is going to be in the output. But with TIE, that's another example of your behavioral output is going to reflect the input. And this was a speech bot that they put on Twitter to prove how good their natural language processing was. And it essentially it started to look like the company it kept. And trolls, our most famous, most populous species on the internet, started interacting with TIE and saying all sorts of inflammatory and obscene things. And so TIE took on that speech behavior and they had to unplug it.
Yeah, it was fun to see. And in my understanding, is context that machines are not yet able to grasp.
Right, and it's a major limitation. And this is what I mean by, narrow intelligence can be a very powerful thing, but we have to use it in the right way. We have to leverage it with human judgment in order for it to actually help enterprise, because you could design a super intelligent chess playing engine. And we've done that, Deep Blue, and it could be playing genius level chess, but not appreciate that the room it's in is on fire and that it should actually find a way out of that room. And now we have a superhuman Go player, and it's got subject to the same vulnerability. It can't appreciate context. So it could be making these genius moves on the playing board and not realize that there's a fire in the room and it should move. So a toddler would know better than this supercomputing power. And that's because of our inherent ability to understand the environmental context. And that's what general intelligence gives us. And I don't know that we're ever going to have artificial general intelligence. It's not like it's an unreasonable goal. It's hard to imagine that we would program something that took billions of years to produce, that we would program that within 100 years. And so that sounds pessimistic, but actually I'm being very optimistic and saying we don't need AGI to get super powerful, extraordinary results from using AI. We just need to combine it with humans in the right way.
Despite what Alibaba's Jack Ma says, he envisions the best CEO in the world on the cover of Time magazine in 30 years being a robot.
I mean, possibly. I don't think that's the case. I think what we're going to find is the best CEO is going to be the one who uses computers and decision support in the right way. And that could be they have an enterprise solution that's amazing, or it could just be that that they followed Kasparov's law.
Indeed. Let's see what the future holds for us. I would like to conclude our conversation with a quote I found in your book that says, "The new smart will be determined not by what or how you know, but by the quality of your thinking, listening, relating, collaborating, and learning. Quantity is replaced by quality. And that shift will enable us to focus on the hard work of taking our cognitive and emotional skills to a much higher level."
That's a great quote from Ed Hess, who's written on the need for humility in our decision making. And I think that's a really great example. We can achieve extraordinary outcomes if we acknowledge our limits, that we can't do it alone, that we need to debias ourselves, that we need to use technology to make data-driven decisions and to do the right computations, and that we can only really get there if we understand our limitations and have some intellectual humility.
John, before we say arrivederci, I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. So I ask you, what are you interested in beside practicing the law, which I understand is your core business, and writing books about artificial intelligence?
Oh, I love poetry. It's just a power of language, and it's something that I've always appreciated, the trying to find the best of what's been thought and said by humanity, and to just cherish that. And that's what I do. You know, that's my passion project outside of work, and writing for executives on these strategic and ethical issues is just savoring good poetry and writing poems myself.
Oh, I look forward to reading one of those. John Wood, thank you for sharing with us your wisdom and for being on the show.